We already own the farm, Ruth. You just kept the cows fed. My brother Cole said it across a lawyer's table, 3 weeks after we buried our mother, and he didn't even lower his voice. I'm Ruth, the oldest. 40 years on 320 acres, the 430 milkings, the scholarship I never mailed, and my 2 younger brothers had decided out loud that all of it made me the help. I didn't argue. I reached into my purse. Inside, it was one folded piece of paper, a quitclaim deed pulled from the county recorder's office for $40, soft at the creases from how many times I'd read it. It had Wendell's signature, it had Cole's, it had our mother's, and it had a date. They thought the farm was settled, signed, done. They had no idea that date was sitting in my purse, or what it would do when somebody read it out loud. Sit with me. I've been waiting to say this out loud. I save stories like this for the nights the house is too quiet, for the nights the people who were supposed to share the load turn out to have been measuring it instead. So tell me, before I go on, if the people you'd worked beside your whole life looked you in the eye and called you the help, would your voice have stayed level? Mine did. I'll show you how. Now, let me tell you how it began. Let me back up, because you need to understand the farm before you can understand what they took, or none of it lands the way it should. I'm the oldest, Ruth. 3 years on Wendell, 6 on Cole. And on a farm, being the oldest is not a title. It's a job description handed to you before you're tall enough to reach the latch on the barn door. Our place was 320 acres outside a town I won't name. Dairy, mostly. A little corn. A stand of black walnut my grandfather planted that my father swore he'd never cut. I grew up to the sound of that farm. I learned to drive on its tractor at 11 because my father's back went out during a hay season and somebody had to bring the bales in. That somebody was always going to be me. The boys were younger, and then the boys were busy, and then the boys were gone. Wendell to a parts business 2 counties over, Cole to selling insurance in the city, and I was the one who stayed. Not because anybody asked, because the cows don't care whose turn it is. They need milking at 4:30, whether you feel like a daughter or a servant that morning. I want to give you one small picture, because it tells you everything about the arithmetic of our family. When I was 16, I had a chance to go away to the State Agricultural College on a scholarship. A real one, the kind that doesn't come twice. I'd filled out the forms at the kitchen table by lamplight, and the week before I was supposed to send them, my father's hip gave out, and my mother's hands had started their slow curl with the arthritis, and there was a barn full of animals and nobody else to do the 4:30. So I didn't send the forms. I told everyone it was fine. I told myself it was just 1 year, and then it was just one more. And somewhere in there, the forms stopped being a thing I'd put off and started being a thing I'd given up. Nobody ever thanked me for that, because in our family, the thing you sacrifice quietly is assumed to be the thing you didn't want anyway. Hold on to that, because it is the engine of everything that came later. I had learned, young, to make myself indispensable and silent at the same time. And a person who is indispensable and silent is the easiest person in the world to write out of a will. I'll tell you exactly when I learned to keep the receipts, because that habit is going to matter more than anything else in this story. And I want you to see it being born. I was 19. Cole was 13, and he'd taken the truck without asking and put the front fender into the gatepost down by the lower field. He came running to me, not to our father, because I was the one who fixed things before they became weather in that house. I drove the truck to a body man 2 towns over, paid him out of my own egg money, and I told Cole to keep his mouth shut. But before I handed over $1, I made the man write me a receipt, the date, the work, the amount, and I folded it into the back of my checkbook. I didn't even know why I did it. I just knew, the way you know a storm by the smell of it before the first drop, that in our family, the people who did the quiet covering were the people most likely to be told later it never happened. I wanted proof I'd existed in the room. By the time I was 40, I had a shoebox of those receipts. co-signed loans, vet bills I'd paid that the boys had promised to split, a note in Wendell's handwriting that said he'd pay me back for the new milk tank. He never did. I kept all of it, not out of bitterness, but because keeping the receipts was the only way a silent woman ever got to say, "This happened," out loud. "Remember that shoebox? We are going to open it before we're done. And I should tell you about my brothers as boys, so you understand they didn't turn into this overnight. Wendell was the careful one, the one who counted things. Marbles, baseball cards, the cookies on the plate to make sure he got his half and a sliver of yours. Even small, he had a way of looking at what was on the table and quietly deciding what portion of it was rightfully his. Cole was different. All charm. The kind of boy who could talk a teacher out of a tardy and a girl out of a phone number in the same afternoon. He was the one Mama lit up for. When Cole walked into a room, she straightened in her chair like the sun had come out. I loved them both, in the worn-down, automatic way you love people you've fed and bandaged and covered for since before you could spell your own name. I drove Wendell to his first job interview. I co-signed Cole's first truck loan, the one he paid late for 2 years, and I covered twice without ever telling Mama, because telling her would have dimmed the way she looked at him, and I had long since decided that protecting her good opinion of her sons was one more chore that fell to the oldest. I tell you this so you understand the shape of it. I was not their sister, so much as their first line of defense against consequences. And a person who spends 40 years standing between the family and the bill should not be surprised when the family starts to think of her as a fixture rather than an heir. I was surprised anyway. That's the part that still gets me, some nights. Not that they did it, but that I didn't see it coming from people I had watched count cookies their whole lives. Now let me tell you about my mother, because she is the soft center of all of this. And I won't have you thinking she was the villain. She wasn't. She was a tired woman who had buried a husband and run a farm office out of a shoebox of receipts for the last 15 years of her life. And she trusted her sons the way mothers of that generation were taught to, as the future, as the ones who'd carry the name. She loved me. I know she did, but she loved me the way you love the floor you stand on. You don't look at it. You just count on it being there. And toward the end, when the cancer came and the fog came with it, she signed things she was told to sign, because the men telling her to sign were her boys, and she had spent her whole life believing her boys would do right. There's one more person you need to meet before the trouble starts, because she's going to matter at the end, and I won't have her arrive as a stranger. Her name is Hazel. She farmed the quarter section that bordered ours to the east for 50 years. And before that, she'd worked 20 years in the county courthouse, the deeds room, the recorder's office, the very place this story turns on, though I didn't know yet that her hands had touched 1,000 documents just like the one that would undo my brother's. Hazel and my mother had been girls together. They'd quilted together, buried husbands a year apart, and in the last years, it was Hazel who'd drive over with a casserole on the days I couldn't get to the stove because I was somewhere between the milk parlor and the hospital. Hazel saw my mother more clearly than her own sons did. She sat with her on the bad afternoons. She heard her call me by my dead aunt's name. And Hazel, being a woman who'd spent 20 years watching families try to move land out from under each other, had a courthouse memory and a courthouse nose, and she did not miss things. Keep her in your mind. The boys forgot she was there. That was their first real mistake, though it would be the last one I'd use against them. That is where the deed comes in. And I need you to understand that I did not go looking for it as some kind of detective. I found my way to it the way most people find the truth about their families, by accident and too late to be surprised. It started with a property tax notice. The spring before Mama passed, when I was driving her to her treatments 3 days a week and running the farm the other 4, the tax bill came to the house, like it always did. Except this one didn't have my mother's name on the parcel anymore. It had Wendell's and Cole's. I remember standing at the mailbox at the end of our long gravel drive. the envelope shaking a little in my hand, telling myself it was a clerical thing, a county computer being a county computer. I called the recorder's office to straighten it out, and the woman on the phone, kind and bored, told me that the parcel had transferred, that there was a recorded quitclaim deed on file, that if I wanted a copy, I could come in and it would be $40. A quitclaim deed, in case you've never had the misfortune of needing to know, is a way of signing over your interest in a piece of land to somebody else, fast and quiet, without all the protections a real sale would carry. You don't need a buyer. You don't need a price. You barely need a witness. It is the instrument families use when they want a thing moved before anybody thinks to ask why. My mother had signed her 320 acres over to my 2 brothers with one of them. And the date on that recording, the date the woman read off her screen to me at the kitchen table while my mother slept in the next room, that date was 8 months before my mother died. 8 months. Back when Mama was deep in the fog, when she'd call me by my dead aunt's name some afternoons, when she signed her own treatment consent forms with a hand I had to steady, I want to let that sit for a second, the way it sat in me. Because the cruelty of it wasn't the land. I could have made peace with the land. The cruelty was the timing. They had not waited for her to be gone. They had reached past her while she was still breathing, while I was the one wiping her chin and reading her the weather, and they had moved the ground out from under all 3 of us and recorded it down at the courthouse like a man filing a parking permit. I didn't say anything to anyone, but I started watching. And once you start watching, you start seeing. And what I saw in those weeks turned my stomach worse than the deed had, because the deed, at least, was an old wound by the time I found it. What I started seeing was fresh, and it was happening while my mother was still alive to be hurt by it if she'd had the wits left to understand. The first thing was the appraiser. I came in from the 4:31 gray morning, still in my barn coat, and there was a strange sedan parked in our drive, and a man in a windbreaker walking my father's hay ground with a clipboard, pacing it off, photographing the barn, the house, the equipment shed. I asked him what he thought he was doing on my mother's land. He looked at his clipboard, a little embarrassed, and said he'd been hired to do a valuation. By whom? I asked. He checked the paper again and said, a Mr. Cole Bratcher. My brother had sent a man to put a price on the place. The house my mother was dying inside of, the barn she'd been married out the door of. While she still drew breath in the front bedroom, I sent the appraiser off the property, but I noticed he didn't seem surprised to be sent off. He'd done this before, for families like mine. That was the first rung, and I climbed it without a word, and I added the appraiser's company name to the shoebox. The second thing was worse because it had numbers on it. A few weeks later, Wendell came out. A rare thing, Wendell coming out to the farm, and he sat at my mother's own kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started in front of me, dividing the place. Not asking, dividing. The dairy ground's worth more per acre than the corn ground, he told me, like I didn't know the soil I'd worked my whole life. Cole takes the road frontage, I take the bottoms, and the home parcel. He tapped his pen on the pad twice. The home parcel, we'll figure out. We'll figure out. The house I was born in, the porch I'd painted 3 times, the walnut trees, reduced to a thing 2 men would figure out over a legal pad while their sister stood at her own stove. And the whole time down the hall our mother slept, the woman who supposedly wanted all this, who couldn't have told you what a road frontage was by then if you'd spelled it for her. I asked Wendell, very quietly, whether Mama knew he was sitting at her table carving up her farm. He didn't even look up. Mama's not really part of this anymore, Ruth, he said. And there it was, said out loud, the truest thing either of them ever told me. As far as my brothers were concerned, our mother was already gone, and so was I. The third thing was the smallest, and it's the one I still can't talk about without my throat closing. The home aid. By summer, Mama needed a woman to come sit with her the afternoons I couldn't, to help her to the bathroom, to make sure she ate. That aid cost money, and I paid it the way I paid everything, out of the farm account I'd run for 15 years. But when the bill ran long 1 month, I asked the boys to split it, the way they'd always promised to split and never did. Wendell mailed me a check for his share, and clipped to it, in his careful hand, a yellow sticky note that said, "Thanks, Ruthie. Thanks, Ruthie, for arranging the comfort of the dying woman whose land he'd already taken. He thanked me for it like I was the help, and I want you to hold on to that sticky note because I did." I peeled it off that check and I put it in the shoebox with the receipts, and it never once occurred to me in that low moment that a 4-word note in my brother's own handwriting, dated, admitting that I was the one running our mother's care while he was off appraising her grave, would one day sit in a lawyer's office like a loaded thing on the table. The quiet ones keep the receipts. Sometimes we don't even know yet which ones will go off. That was the spring and summer I learned the difference between grief and theft. Grief is something a family does together, around a bed, in a kitchen, with casseroles. Theft is something 2 men do with a legal pad while the third person stands there, holding the dish towel. I was grieving my mother before she was gone. They were inventorying her. And I said nothing, and I kept watching, and I kept the receipts because some quiet part of me had already understood that the day was coming when somebody would call me the help to my face, and I intended to be ready. I want to tell you about the day I actually held the deed because it changed something in me. I didn't confront them. Not then. I want to be honest with you about that because I think there's a version of this story where the brave woman storms in and throws the paper down, and that is not what I did, and not who I am. What I did was drive into town on a Tuesday, on the one afternoon Mama had a sitter, and I paid my $40, and I stood at that counter and watched a clerk run the copy through a machine, and I folded it into a square and put it in my purse, and then I went home and made dinner, because my mother was still alive, and she did not need to die knowing what her sons had done. And because I had learned a long time ago that the loudest thing in any room is the person who already knows how it ends and is in no hurry to say. But something happened at that counter I haven't told you yet, and it's the thread I need you to follow. The clerk who pulled my copy was young and didn't know me, but there was an older woman behind her, sorting documents at a back table, gray-haired, sharp-eyed. And when she heard the parcel number read aloud, she looked up. It was Hazel. She still came in 2 mornings a week to help the office she'd given 20 years to. She didn't say anything in front of the young clerk. She just caught my eye, and she looked down at the deed in my hand, and then back at me, and she gave the smallest shake of her head. Not at me. At it. At the thing itself. As I was leaving, she followed me out to the parking lot, walking stiff on her bad hip, and she said only this, "Ruth, I was in the back the day that came across the counter to be recorded. Your brothers brought it in themselves. Your mother wasn't with them." And then she put her dry old hand on my arm and said, "Whatever you decide to do, you come to me first. I've watched men do this to women in that office for 40 years, and I am not too old to be a thorn." I didn't know yet what that thorn would be worth. I drove home with the deed in my purse, and, for the first time since the mailbox, the feeling that I was not entirely alone in the world. I carried that deed for 8 months while my mother died, and I need to let those 8 months breathe a little here, because if I skip past them, you'll think I'm made of something harder than I am, and I'm not. There were nights in that house, the same house they'd already signed away under me, when I'd come in from the 4:30 milking with my hands cracked and aching, and I'd sit on the edge of my mother's bed and read her the weather like she'd asked, and she'd look at me with those clouded eyes and say, "You're a good girl, whoever you are. Whoever you are." She didn't always know me by then, and I'd sit there knowing what was in my purse downstairs, knowing the men she still asked after, still wanted by her bed, had reached past her dying body for the only thing she had to leave, and I would not say it. I would read her the high temperature and the chance of rain, and I would smooth her hair, and I would carry it. Some nights I cried in the milk parlor where the machines were loud enough to cover it, because there was nowhere else in that house that was mine to cry in. I want you to understand that the dignity I'm going to show you later, the level voice in the lawyer's office, that came at a price, and the price was 8 months of swallowing a thing that could have burned the last of her peace to the ground. I chose her peace. I would choose it again. But don't let anyone tell you that the quiet ones don't bleed. We just do it where the machines are loud. And through those months, Hazel came. She came on the afternoons I couldn't be two places, and she'd sit with Mama and do the thing I'll be grateful for till I die. She paid attention. She kept a little spiral notebook in her apron pocket, the kind she'd used in the recorder's office her whole life, and without my asking, she started writing down what she saw. Not for me, for the record, the way a courthouse woman keeps a record by instinct. The day Mama didn't know her own kitchen and asked Hazel whose house this was. The afternoon Mama signed a birthday card to a grandnephew and wrote her own maiden name, the name she hadn't used in 60 years. The morning she couldn't tell the calendar on the wall from the church bulletin in her lap. Hazel wrote the date next to each one in her small flat clerk's hand, the way she'd dated 10,000 deeds. She didn't tell me she was doing it. She just slid the notebook across to me one evening at the kitchen table, months before any of this came to a head, and said, "A document is only as good as the date on it, Ruth. I taught your brother's lawyer that lesson myself 30 years ago when he was a boy clerking for me. He's forgotten it. You won't." I took that notebook and I put it in the shoebox. 2 records now, hers and mine, both built around dates, both waiting. I carried that deed through the hospice nights and the last good afternoon when she was lucid and held my hand and called me by my right name and said she was proud of how I'd kept the place. That afternoon is the one I keep. The fog lifted for an hour, the way it sometimes does at the very end, like the tide pulling back to show you the shore one last time. And she looked at me, Ruth, not at whoever you are. And she said the land had always been safest in my hands. She didn't know she'd signed it out of them. I never told her. I carried it through the funeral where Wendell gave a eulogy about hard work and family land that I had to stand and listen to with my hands folded, while Cole dabbed at his eyes in the front pew like a man who hadn't recorded a quitclaim deed 8 months prior. I carried it the way you carry a stone in your coat, not because you're going to throw it, but because some mornings the weight of it is the only thing that tells you you're still standing. And at that funeral, Hazel sat 3 rows back in a navy dress, and when Wendell got to the part of the eulogy about how the land had always meant family, I saw her open her purse and check that her little notebook was still in it, and then close the clasp and look at me. We had not spoken of it since the kitchen. We didn't need to. 2 old women and a girl who'd kept the cows fed all knew the same thing, and we all knew. The day to say, it had not come yet. And then came the will. You'd think, if you'd already deeded the farm to yourselves, you wouldn't need the will reading to go any particular way. But here is what I have learned about people who take things quietly. They are never satisfied with the taking. They need the story, too. They need everyone in the room to nod along to a version where they were always the rightful ones. Wendell and Cole didn't just want the 320 acres. They wanted me to sign a separate paper that morning, a little release the lawyer had drawn up at their request, acknowledging that I had no claim on the estate and waiving my right to contest anything. They wanted me to put my name to my own erasure. That was the price of keeping the peace, Cole explained, in the same tone he used to say I'd only kept the cows fed. Sign the waiver and there'd be a fair amount set aside for me, a number they'd already decided, the way they decided everything, in a room I was never invited into. The night before, I drove out to Hazel's. I sat at her kitchen table the way Mama used to, and I laid the whole shoebox out between us. The deed, the sticky note, the receipts, her spiral notebook. And I asked her plainly, "Is this enough?" Hazel put on her reading glasses and she went through it the way she'd gone through documents for half a century, slow, touching each one, reading the dates aloud under her breath. And when she was done, she took the glasses off and she said, "Ruth, you have been treated like the help so long you don't even know what you're holding. This isn't a grievance. This is a case. The deed is the spine of it. The date is the throat, and every other thing in this box is a hand around that throat." Then she said the thing I drove home repeating to myself like a hymn. Don't argue with them tomorrow. Arguing is what they want. It lets them call you bitter. Just ask one question and let the date answer it. I asked her if she'd come with me. She said no. Not because she was afraid, but because, she said, "An ally who shows up early gets spent early. You keep me in your back pocket, girl. If they fight you past that room, that's when an old clerk with a dated notebook walks in." She was teaching me, even then, the patience of the long game. I had spent 40 years learning it the hard way. She handed it to me in one sentence over a kitchen table. I remember the drive into town that morning better than I remember most of my own birthdays. It was an ordinary gray day, the fields on either side of the road just starting to green, and I drove past our own fence line on the way to a lawyer's office to be told I had no claim to anything behind it. I dressed carefully. Not for them, for me. A clean blouse, my mother's small gold earrings, my hair pinned the way she liked it. When you've spent your life being treated as the help, there is a quiet power in walking into the room looking like a woman who belongs at the table, even when everyone there has already decided you don't. I parked. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel and my purse on the seat beside me, and I did not rehearse a speech. I had learned long ago that speeches are for people who aren't sure they're right. I just made sure the deed was where I could reach it without fumbling. Then I went in and sat down across from my brothers, and Cole said his line about the cows, and I let him. The lawyer was a decent enough man, older, uncomfortable, the kind who'd done 100 of these and could feel a bad one coming. And I'll tell you something I noticed the second I walked in, something Hazel's words had primed me to see. He wouldn't quite look at my brothers. He was their lawyer, but he had the careful stillness of a man who suspected he'd been handed a job he didn't fully like. He slid the waiver across the table to me. He had a pen ready, and Cole said, "It's just a formality, Ruth. The farm's settled. It's been settled." I looked at that pen for a long moment. The room was very still. I could hear the heat ticking in the old radiator under the window, and a phone ringing somewhere down the hall, and Wendell's chair creaking as he shifted, impatient, certain, a man waiting for a signature he'd already spent. Cole had his charming face on, the one Mama used to straighten in her chair for, the one that had talked teachers and girls and loan officers into whatever Cole needed. He was so sure. They were both so sure. And that sureness, I want to tell you, is the thing that finally steadied my hands all the way. Because I had spent 8 months and 40 years being underestimated in that exact way. And there is a strange calm that comes over a woman the moment she realizes the people across the table have no idea what she's holding. I thought about the 4:30 milkings and the scholarship forms I never mailed, and the porch I'd painted 3 times, and the walnut trees my grandfather planted that I had promised a dying woman I would never let her sons cut down. I thought about the appraiser pacing the hayground and Wendell's pen tapping the legal pad and the sticky note that said, "Thanks, Ruthie." I thought about Hazel saying, "Ask one question and let the date answer it." And then I did the thing I'd been getting ready to do for 8 months without letting myself believe I'd actually do it. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to know that. I reached into my purse and I took out the square of paper, soft at its creases, and I unfolded it slowly on the table, smoothing it flat with the side of my hand the way you smooth a tablecloth. And I slid it across to the lawyer, past the waiver, past the pen. "Before I sign anything," I said, "I'd like you to read this into the record, out loud, all of it, especially the date." The room got very quiet. Wendell's arms came uncrossed. Cole leaned forward. For a second, nobody breathed, and I watched the certainty start to drain out of my brothers' faces by degrees, the way light leaves a field in the evening, slow and then all at once. The lawyer picked it up. I watched him read the first lines to himself, and I watched his face do the thing a careful man's face does when he realizes he's holding something heavier than he was told. He looked at Wendell. He looked at Cole. And I saw him understand in that moment exactly why he'd been uneasy walking in. He looked back down at the paper, and then, because he was an officer of the court and not their employee, he read it out loud. He read that it was a quitclaim deed. He read the legal description of the parcel, all 320 acres, the dairy ground and the corn ground and the stand of black walnut. He read Wendell's name as grantee and Cole's name as grantee. He read my mother's name as grantor and the shaky line of her signature. I watched Cole's hand find the edge of the table, and then he read the recording date. He read the month and the day and the year. And every person at that table did the arithmetic at the same time, because every person at that table knew exactly when my mother had died, and exactly how many months before that this signature had been pressed onto the page by a hand I'd had to steady. 8 months. He said the date, and then nobody said anything, and the 8 months hung in the air over that brown carpet like smoke. Cole's face went a color I'd never seen on it. Wendell started to say something about how Mama had wanted it that way, how it was her wish, and I let him get 4 words in before I said, quietly, "She couldn't tell the calendar from the phone book by then, Wendell. You know that. You sent me the bill for the home aid. You signed it, 'Thanks, Ruthie,' on a sticky note." I reached into my purse again, and I laid the sticky note on the table beside the deed, dated in his own careful hand. I kept it. Then I laid down one more thing, because Hazel had taught me that a date is only as strong as the witness who can swear to it. "And there's a woman," I said, "who worked 20 years in the recorder's office where you filed this, who was standing in the back the morning you two walked it in to be recorded, without Mama. She kept a notebook of Mama's good days and bad days, dated, all last year. She's prepared to bring it." I let that land. A person who learns young to be silent learns just as young to keep the receipts. I kept everything. So did she. I didn't make a scene. I made it undeniable. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a story like mine usually turns into a fantasy, and I promised you the truth. The deed did not magically hand me the farm back across that table. The law doesn't work in a single dramatic morning. What that deed did was something better and quieter. A quitclaim signed by a person who lacked the capacity to understand what she was signing. And we had 8 months of medical records, hospice notes, a steadied hand, and now a dated notebook in a former clerk's own writing to show it. Is a deed a court can set aside. The lawyer, to his credit, stopped the proceeding right there. He would not let me sign their waiver. He told my brothers, in the flat voice of a man protecting his own license, that he was obligated to advise them the transfer was vulnerable, and that if I chose to challenge it, the recording date alone would be a problem they could not talk their way around. And then he said one more thing, half to himself. That told me he'd placed Hazel's name the moment I said, "Recorder's office." "If you mean who I think you mean," he said, "I clerked for her. I would not want to be on the other side of her notebook." Hazel had been right. She'd taught the boy his own undoing 30 years before he sat down to undo my brother's. I did challenge it. I won't drag you through the months of it. The lawyer I hired, the doctor's letters, the long table in a different office where Wendell and Cole's faces got smaller every time the date came up. But I'll give you the moment it broke because Hazel earned it. When their side tried to claim our mother had been clear-headed and willing the day she signed, my attorney set Hazel's spiral notebook on the table, opened to the page dated 3 days before that signature, where she'd written in her small flat hand that Mama had not known her own kitchen and had asked whose house she was in. Then he set down the deed beside it. Same week, same fog, one a private note from the woman who sat with her, the other a public record my brothers had walked into a courthouse to file. The date was the throat, and Hazel's notebook was the hand around it, exactly as she'd said over her own kitchen table. In the end, they did not fight it to a verdict, because their own attorney told them what mine had. The date was the whole case, and the date was not on their side. We settled. The farm came back into the estate where it should have been all along, to be divided 3 ways the way my mother's actual handwritten will. The real one, the one from before the fog, and had said. A third for Wendell, a third for Cole, a third for me. The first thing in 40 years that was, on paper, mine. And here is the boundary I set, because I know that's what some of you are waiting to hear. I did not take the whole farm. I could have pushed for more, given what they'd tried to do. I didn't. I took my third, the home parcel, the house, the barn, and the stand of black walnut my grandfather planted, the acres that had my whole life in the soil. And I told my brothers, across that last table, that they were welcome to their thirds and welcome to walk the property any time they liked as my guests, but that the deed to the home place was now in my name only, and that the next time one of them wanted to move something that belonged to all 3 of us, they would do it in a room I was invited into, or they would not do it at all. Doors, not walls. They could come to the table. They could not sign the table out from under me again. The consequences rippled out for the better part of a year, and I won't pretend I didn't watch them fall. Cole had built his whole life on the face Mama lit up for. The charm, the trust, the handshake. He sold insurance to half the county on that face. And a small county is a small county. Word of how a man treated his dying mother does not stay inside a lawyer's office. I never said a word to anyone. I didn't have to. 2 of his oldest clients, church people who'd known Mama, quietly moved their policies elsewhere that spring. The charm that had talked its way through 40 years stopped working the one place it had always worked, and I think that cost him more than the third of the farm he kept. Cole hasn't spoken to me since. The appraiser's valuation, the one he'd ordered while she was still breathing, was never used for anything but evidence of how early he'd started measuring. Wendell was different. Wendell did the math, the way Wendell always had, and the math finally came out somewhere near shame. He did speak to me once, last fall. He drove out and stood at the end of the gravel drive, the same drive where I'd opened that tax notice with shaking hands. And he didn't apologize. Not really. Men like Wendell rarely have the words. But he looked at the porch I'd painted 3 times, and he said, "You kept it nice." And then, after a long minute, looking at the walnut trees, and not at me, he said the thing that was as close to the truth as he could get. She really didn't know what she was signing, did she? It wasn't a question. I told him no. She didn't. He nodded once, like a man closing a ledger he'd kept wrong for years, and he got back in his truck. I let him stand there. I didn't invite him in, and I didn't run him off. A door can be open, and you can still be standing in it. And Hazel, because you've been waiting on Hazel, and she earned her ending. The spring after it all settled, she let her own bad hip finally stop her, and she sold her quarter section. She came to me first, the way she'd told me to come to her. She offered me the strip of bottom land that ran along our shared fence, the field her family and mine had argued the line of for 3 generations, and she sold it to me for $1 and a promise. The promise was that I'd let the black walnuts on my grandfather's stand reseed across into it, so that in 30 years there'd be a grove standing on the line both families had only ever fought over. I spent 20 years filing the papers that took land away from people, she told me, sitting on my porch with a glass of tea, the notebook long since retired to my shoebox where it lives now beside the receipts. I wanted to file one last thing that gave some back. She passed 2 winters ago. I planted the first of the new walnuts the morning after her funeral. They're knee-high now. Doors, not walls, and sometimes a grove growing up right across the line where the wall used to be. So that's the story of the $40 piece of paper. I keep it now in the same shoebox where my mother kept her receipts, the one I run the farm office out of beside Hazel's notebook, and the sticky note and 40 years of proof that I existed in the room, And some mornings, when the milking's done and the light's coming up gray over the walnut trees, I think about how close it came to staying folded, how easy it would have been to sign their waiver and take their number, and tell myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping my dignity. It isn't. It never was. The peace they were offering me was just a quieter version of the room I was never invited into. If you've carried a piece of paper like that, a letter, a deed, a note you kept because some part of you knew you'd need it before they were done with you, I'd like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, not for the drama of it, for the company of it. Because the thing nobody tells you about being the one who stayed, the one who kept the cows fed, is how lonely it is right up until the morning you find out you weren't the fool in the room after all. And that, very often, there was another quiet woman somewhere keeping a record of her own. There's another story I'll tell you sometime, about a different table and a different family, about a woman whose sister read her a letter at a Thanksgiving dinner that was supposed to humiliate her. Except the sister didn't know what the woman had found in their mother's sewing box that summer. That one's for another night. For now, it's enough that you came and sat with me. Doors, not walls. For the people who earn the doorway, and a clean closed door for the ones who tried to take the house. For the nights the house is too quiet, remember that the quietest person in the room is very often the one holding the thing that ends the argument. I held mine for 8 months. I'm glad I waited until she was at peace, and I'm glad I didn't wait 1 day longer than that. Pour out what's left in your cup, leave the porch light on for somebody, and come back and sit with me again soon.